think at the end of the day, like people have to sit back and look at what they're doing and say, anything can be learned. You have the internet at your fingertips. There's no excuse to not know how to do something. You might not be an expert at it. I'm not saying someone, reads a book on medicine and becomes a medical doctor. That's really not what it's about. But there's so many things you can watch and then do, right? Learn, implement, and you don't need to have a formal education for that. You don't need to have necessarily apprenticeship. You have so much opportunity to learn on your own. It's just that people are not self-motivated enough to actually do it. And a lot of people say, well, I don't know how to do that. Like that is not an acceptable answer today for anything, right? It's, I might not know how to do it now, but I can probably figure out how to do it if you give me enough time and give me the resources, right? Same thing for everybody. Everyone has the same opportunity. You have the internet, you have a computer, whatever it is, you can go online, watch a video, learn how to do it. Welcome back to the Prospecting Show. Today is May 21st, 2020. We got Mike Pernice on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, sir. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for jumping on the show. To start things off, maybe give us a little background about, where you come from, tell us a little bit about you.
Yes, sir. Like you said, my name is Mike Pernice. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I run the podcast called Stoop Kids 412. Like I said, born and raised in Pittsburgh, went to high school at Pittsburgh Central Catholic, home with Dan Marino. Currently a tri-major at Duquesne University, studying English, education, computer systems technology. And just honestly, man, just trying to find my niche in this crazy world we're living in, and just trying to help people every day.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so with being in school and having the podcast, what do you think you've learned most there? Like, I know the one big thing that I learned a lot about when I was in school was just straight culture, right there. I went to a school up in Canada, University of Western Ontario. I think it's 35,000 students. There's people everywhere. It's a relatively big school. There's like 6 or 7 really large schools in Ontario. And then you come to the US, I live in Pittsburgh too now. And it's a very different environment. So what are your comments, or what kind of things do you see being in the school environment right now and having a podcast?
Honestly, I'm kind of in a great situation, I feel like. So Pittsburgh to me is kind of lacking in terms of like exposure for the music scene. And me being 21 and living in the South Side and going to Duquesne University, I'd say I'm probably the perfect candidate to kind of take that role and try and do something with it. Mostly just because, since I did grow up in Pittsburgh, I have some Pittsburgh connections already. But then obviously going to a university such as Duquesne that has a very high prestigious outlook, that has enabled me to kind of use Duquesne's network too and grow my podcast. So honestly, it's a great situation I'm in right now, and I'm just trying to make the best out of it.
And with education, going to Duquesne and really focusing your efforts there, what have you learned the most, would you say, up to this point in your education? Like, what is the most important thing or concept that you've really kind of been like, hey, I definitely need to take this forward with me in the future?
Okay, so honestly, education in my viewpoint, since I am going to be a future educator, I kind of align myself with Socrates a little bit in terms of like the knowledge is already inside us. We just need guided towards it. So really, the thing that I've gained from my education so far is more. I wouldn't say I've learned more from my real life experiences than I've learned in the classroom. But the classroom has given me this toolbox that I like to call. It's like giving me those skills to really, one, learn how to approach life in terms of approaching it in a positive outlook, not dwelling on negative. It's really given me kind of like a structure. I'm a very routine person. And my educational life has really structured me and kind of anchored me down and given me goals to attain and to set for myself.
Yeah, and that's interesting you say that too, because I talk to a lot of younger people now. I'm 26, going on 27 here, and going through multiple education systems. Partly in Canada with an undergraduate degree, a doctorate in the U.S. I've had the pleasure, I guess, of having both educational systems. And one thing I can say for sure that aligns with kind of what you're just talking about is not everything you're looking for is in the education system, right? Education's super important. Formal school isn't always the only way or isn't the only option for people. But I think a lot of people miss the point of education, right? That the point is to, like you say, take the knowledge, take the skills that you have inside and kind of bring those back out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I think people get caught up in doing, the daily, like, I think one of the problems with school, and I think why a lot of students lose interest, is because, they feel like they're just doing busy work and they don't really understand, what they're learning and how it applies to the real world. As somebody who studies English and wants to teach English in high schools, I look at literature as a way to teach about what's happening in the world today, right? So obviously, right now we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's going to be interesting to see probably within I would say probably within the next decade or two, that we're removed from this and we start having, nonfiction and fiction novels come out about the COVID-19 situation. It's going to be interesting to, for me as a teacher that'll be in the classroom during this time, to take those books and not only use my personal experience from living through it, but to also use the literature to explain to the kids, what life was like, how people dealt with their issues back then. And by doing so and using literature as the vehicle, it enables kids to like really connect, in my opinion, really get out of their own world and enter a new world and learn the skills in this fictional world to then bring with them back into their real world and apply them moving forward.
Yeah, and you're definitely right, right? Things are going to change a lot coming up here. I think you're going to see people have a different approach, a different mindset, a different model that they go through with both healthcare and just doing business, right? This is
Right.
probably the first time that we've had an equal healthcare issue and an even bigger economic issue, right? You look at some of the data around COVID right now. Depending on what side of the fence people sit on, there's somewhat of a geopolitical issue with China and the US. There's a little bit of a political issue just on what people's stances are. There's
Right.
people that are on different sides of the fence for the vaccine. There's a lot of different political components to it, but the one thing that really doesn't lie is, for the most part, the stats, right? And
Right.
and what the stats are showing right now is that yes, there are a lot of people infected. The death rate is probably lower than what we think it is, and the number of exposures is probably significantly higher. It's just hard to, track it in the way that we'd like it to. I
Right.
think on the flip side of that, the part that people haven't talked about as much, they are starting to, but haven't talked about as much, is the economic impact, right? We're at almost 40 million people unemployed in the United States right now, which is well over 10%. And that impact is going to go significantly beyond some people who've been infected with COVID. Yes, there are people who've died. Yes, there are people who've had significant problems because of COVID, but there are a lot of businesses are closing. I just saw, I think it was J.C. Penney and Pier 1 imports that are all going bankrupt, right? They're done, totally
Right.
out of business, with thousands of jobs that are going to be gone with them. So I think we're just sitting on the tip of the iceberg with unemployment. And I'm interested in your stance on whether this is a more of an economic issue or more of a healthcare issue.
Um, honestly, like you said, I think it's kind of both. I think COVID-19 has really drawn a line in the sand for a lot of issues in terms of, basically, I mean, we're in an election year. I mean, let's address the elephant in the room. It is an election year. So it's going to be interesting to see, and like you're already starting to see it with the ads on TV, in terms of, like there's forgetting the one ad sponsorship, but anyways, you're seeing these, like you said, it's like Republican, Democrat, or then it's no vaccine, vaccine, and then also too when it comes to the contact tracing, people are scared of using, because there's this one company that I saw that came out. It's using like the cell phone network towers to conduct contact tracing. And that to me, as somebody who studies computer science, yeah, that's even a little worrisome to me in terms of my privacy. So it's kind of like I feel like we kind of jump back in time a little bit to post 9/11. It's like yes, we want security, but at what risk to our own privacy?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. And I think depending on who you talk to, there's going to be some people who are very interested in the epidemiologic studies and some of these long-term immunological studies where you're saying, who got it, what kind of issues did they have, and where are they around the world? Maybe more so in the US than other countries because that's just a big focus here right now. And then you got
Right,
the other side of it, kind of like you're saying, where it's, hey, we know it's important to actually track this, but at the same time, we don't want to infringe on people's rights. So you kind of get this Republican Democrat back and forth kind of conversation. And I think at the end of the day, people need to understand that it's very difficult to make these decisions, right? I don't think it's easy for one group or one party to say, yeah, this is what we're going to do for everybody. But I think at the same time, people need to understand that a decision has to be made, right? There is some form of decision making process that's going to have to happen. Is a vaccine going to be made? 100% of vaccines going to be made. Is it going to be mandatory? Nah, I don't know, right? It
right,
might be, it might not be. Where's the line drawn with that? Is it religious beliefs? Can you just opt out of it for the sake of opting out? What if people get hurt from the vaccine, right?
right.
There's all these issues that people haven't really considered all the pieces for yet. And in my opinion, I think the issue is going to be the backlash of the legal when this is all done. I think the biggest profiteering here is
Yeah,
definitely going to be legal, right? There's going to be corporations who are sued for bankruptcy and unemployment and mistreating employees, for letting go of employees, for closing down locations, for not paying people properly, for closing out deals. There'll be B2B type transactions that are all messed up. But at the end of the day, I think the small businesses, the ones that are really getting crushed right now, a lot of them are going to disappear and a lot of businesses are going to start going online, which is really interesting because one of the companies that I own, Syntax, is focused on B2B business development. And what I'm
hmm,
seeing right now is the solopreneur or the small business, 5 employees or less, are really going online because they're realizing, hey, I don't necessarily need to go in the office anymore. We don't need to spend
right,
$5,000 a month on rent, right?
right.
So there's through this medical issue that's happened, people are realizing the economic benefits of making some changes. And it's really interesting because I think the youngest people who are really good with technology are starting to realize that a job is no longer required to actually do business.
And the thing is too, like you mentioned, with everything changing in terms of like businesses taking maybe a second look at office space. I think that's one thing that we're going to see is even big companies. So a friend of the family of mine was the CFO of UPMC, and he was just over my house recently, talking to my father, and he was talking about um, yeah, like Frank, like why would we take the office space when now it's like, I know my employees can work for home. So it's like, why am I going to take this financial, risk in terms of liability at the workplace, the office space, the utility bills, all this extra cost that comes up. He's like, if I can save myself, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year by just having people work from home, why would I not capitalize on that?
Yeah, and it's really a no-brainer too. When you look at what, lifestyle, it seems to be a bigger thing. Like people used to have this, let's go 100 years ago. The maybe the man of the household was primarily the worker, the breadwinner, and the female of the household stayed home. And then both started working together. Then it became very much people worked for 30 years at the same place. Now we're
Hmm.
transitioning into 2 to 5 years of work. Now everyone's going remote. Like the
Right.
transition of social norms have changed substantially in the business world. And I think the biggest opportunity right now is work from home. I see probably 40 to 50% of the small business workforce being solopreneurs, people that are working from home. They offer a product or service and they're offering that to the public instead of these huge corporations. The corporations will still exist, but I think more and more people are going to stop working at McDonald's and start working, on a laptop job. I just see it that way. I think people are getting more excited about technology. They have flexibility. And depending on their skill set, I think there's some people that are educated or not educated that can really do a ton from the computer. And they're really starting to see that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it, comes back to addressing the educational system. If you want to make the push, especially for like online education. So I think like the biggest vulnerability that was pointed out during this whole COVID-19 situation was the US education system. we don't have the ability to go online, right? And it's kind of shown because one, you don't know whether or not your student has access to the internet, has a computer, has parental guidance that can help him with his or her homework. And second off, I saw Pittsburgh Public School District was sending out these like big workbook packets for students who didn't have access to a computer or access to the internet, right? But the problem that they were finding out with these packets is a lot of these kids are going home to nobody there. You know what I mean? It's, they're growing up with a grandmother, or they're growing up with their uncle, or, their parents aren't maybe not in the picture as much as, maybe your and my parents might have been. So when you have a fourth grader sitting down with this big workbook packet, trying to teach himself, simple addition that's easy for you and I, that's a very complicated task for somebody at that age to conquer on their own when they don't have a teacher or just a mentor to call on and ask for help.
That's for sure, right? There's really no two ways about it. I mean, at the end of the day, the education system, I'm actually a huge proponent of this. Like, I really think the education system needs to be changed a lot, because
Mhm.
you look at, like, I'm really big into reading, a lot of audiobooks, Audible, things like that. And I spend a lot of time in professional development books,
Okay.
things like 4 Hour Work Week, Never Split the Difference, How to Win Friends and Influence People, those kind of books. And right now I'm listening to Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And you realize that the skills that he teaches about negotiating, that should be a core component of school if you want people to understand how to negotiate contracts, little things like projects,
Right.
whatever it is, to learn that skill. And you start to realize that the people who become more self-educated, not formally educated, have so many daggers in the bag. Like, now that I've learned some of the skills from Chris Voss, from his audiobook,
Hmm.
like, it's an unfair advantage. It's not even close, because you learn the skills, and if you go up against somebody else who's never read it or never learned those skills, it's not even going to be close. It's like taking it's like taking LeBron James and having him play basketball against a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
It's not even remotely possible. You know what I mean? So the
Right.
education's important. I think the formal school system, K through 12 plus undergraduate degrees plus doctorate and masters and some of these higher level educations, where they fall short is they don't teach what's necessarily important. They teach what the bureaucracy kind of sits back and says, this is what we think you should know, right? And
Right.
I think that's the problem with education. I think the major thing that needs to focus is people need to realize, if you can look it up, there's no sense in memorizing it. There really isn't. Anything that you can put into a calculator, why spend all the time to learn how to do all these things? Like, spend the time learning how to learn. Don't spend the time on how to do rote memory type stuff, right?
Right.
Perfect example here. You have your education. My education originally is in the sciences. I got a doctorate of chiropractic. I could tell you right now, 50% of that degree is rote memorization, just learning where stuff is. And honestly, application wise, it's really not that important. It really isn't,
Hmm.
because the chiropractic degree is really focused around treating the spine and musculoskeletal conditions and nerve pain and things like that. And really making sure that people have great posture, and a lot of those things that people look at chiropractor for. But what a lot of people don't understand is we spend hours and hours and hours looking at things like visceral pathology, right? Looking at liver disease. Like, that's
Right.
not part of what we do, yet we spend a crazy amount of time learning about it. And at the end of the day, it's great to be well rounded, but is that really essential? I think no.
Right. And that's kind of one of the issues that I bumped into when I went into college. So I originally started off as a biomedical engineer. Um, and after a semester of that and trying to balance BME at a 18 credit load and play football my first semester freshman year was just a lot to handle. And like I really just didn't like feel that my heart was in it, so I made that change into my new majors now. And it was, one of the things that I had to go through was like credit adjustments and like losing credits, and it's kind of it's like, do I really need to take this? If I'm going into English, do I really need to take Calc 1? Like, I'm not going to use it for anything that I'm going into. Why do I have to take Calc 1? You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I
and the
get
breadth requirements are like that, right? That's the whole issue, is that I always joke with people, I took calc as well, and there's only 5 answers in calc, right? -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, right? That's basically all of calc 1000, right? You got those 5
right,
options for everything. So, or undefined in some level. So, that to me seems like a really kind of waste of time, given the fact that it might be teaching you problem solving, but at the end of the day, a lot of people get through calc not understanding what they're actually doing. They're just kind of figuring out how to answer questions. And if you
right,
take that person and put them into a situation where they need to problem solve, they still can't. So I think a lot of people say, oh, no, school's about problem solving, teaching people how to work through issues, collaboration, and things like that. And although that might be true, I mean, there's a lot better ways to teach that, right? You can do a lot of small group setting, large group setting problem solving,
right.
and you can put people into working environments, maybe not super young. I know there's a lot of issues with that too, but you can put people into working environments where they have to problem solve
Hmm.
without having to spend $50,000 a year.
Yeah. And that's kind of one thing I've always like that I've always wondered what happened to like apprenticeships. You know what I mean? It's like if you wanted to be a blacksmith, it's like you went and you worked with a blacksmith to learn how to be a blacksmith. And it's like, when I talk to friends of mine who have graduated out of the education program, they're like, you don't really learn they're like, I didn't learn how to become a teacher in college. It's like, it took me about 3 to 5 years in my career to learn how to be a teacher. It's like,
Oh yeah.
I learned the policies, I mean, I learned, what my policies were in like how to basically structure a day, but I didn't learn how to actually teach the information or connect with my students, make sure I was creating an inclusive classroom. All these things that what we claim to like a master teacher that should be able to accomplish. You don't learn that stuff in college. You learn that out in the real world, and a lot of that, to me, a lot of your education in general is learned through your real life experiences. Um, you know, Personally, like I knew nothing about podcasts at all. I don't know if you did either, but I decided I wanted to do it, so I went and learned about it. I went and did my research. I went and found what software I should be using to edit my podcast. What's the best platform to use to distribute it, graphics. All the ins and outs of the podcast world. I've learned from YouTube, not from my classroom.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, right? I think at the end of the day, like, people have to sit back and look at what they're doing and say, anything can be learned. You have the internet at your fingertips. There's no excuse to not know how to do something. You might not be an expert at it. I'm not saying someone, reads a book on medicine and becomes a medical doctor. That's really not what it's about. But there's so many things you can watch and then do, right?
Right.
Learn, implement. And you don't need to have a formal education for that. You don't need to have necessarily apprenticeship. You have so much opportunity to learn on your own. It's just that people are not self-motivated enough to actually do it. And a lot of people say, well, I don't know how to do that. Like, that is not an acceptable answer today for anything, right?
Hmm.
I might not know how to do it now, but I can probably figure out how to do it if you give me enough time and give me the resources, right? Same
Right.
thing for everybody. Everyone has the same opportunity. You have the internet, you have a computer, whatever it is, you can go online, watch a video, learn how to do it. Do you want to file a end of year tax return on your own? Maybe, maybe not, but you definitely can learn how to do it for sure.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's kind of the part that I think is interesting going forward here is I always say, school is not as important as education. Education is what matters, right? People
Right.
need to go to school. Their teachers are very important. They're definitely needed. But education is really what people are after. They're trying to push the boundaries of what they know today versus what they're going to know tomorrow. And some people, they'll spend $100,000 to go to 4 years of undergraduate, and then they won't go spend $1,000 to learn when they're 35.
Right.
They won't take a course. They won't
Right.
get coaching. They won't get consulting. They won't, like, you just spent $100,000 on school. Why are you so worried about spending $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 on coaching for your
I
own
think
professional life?
I think the biggest discouragement for a lot of people is, you know, myself. I'll just use myself as an example. Like I said, I'm majoring in 3 different degrees, right? And I just finished my third year, and I'm feeling burned out. You know what I mean? Like I've been nonstop. I take summer classes every summer, so I'd never have a time off where I'm not in school. So I think a lot of people just get burned out of the process and of the grind. And when you amount hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt on top of it, I think that's what puts a lot of distaste in people's mouths. Is like, okay, so it's almost like you're thought to believe that to get educated, it's like you have to spend this certain amount of money. You know what I mean?
Well, that's the crazy part though, is like I had this conversation the other day with a young kid. I shouldn't say kid. He's going into his first year of undergraduate. And I said to him, I said, you're going into school, but let me walk you through this exercise real quick. And he said, okay, what's the exercise? Well, I said, why don't you give me $1 right now and I'll give you $5 back. So he gives me the dollar, I give him $5 back. I said, is that a good trade? And he said, yes. I said, okay, well, let's flip it around. You give me $5 now and I'm going to give you $1 back. And he said, well, I don't want to do that deal. And I said, why not? Well, the trade didn't make sense. And I said, that second trade didn't make sense, but that is exactly what you are doing by going to school. You are going to go trade $5, right? You're going to go trade 150 grand, 200 grand to go make $30,000 to $50,000 a year.
Yeah.
And people don't realize that, plus interest, right? 3 to 7%, maybe more if you do a grad plus, something like that. But you're going to pay an accrual interest on debt to go to school to make less money than what the school costs. And it's going to take you 20 years to pay it.
Yeah.
How's that a good investment?
Yeah. And, and I think that's one thing that these universities are going to, take a look at after this whole pandemic, is because people aren't going to be able to afford, like Duquesne itself is what, 50, I think like 55 or 57. It's like almost $60,000 a year.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's crazy.
People ain't going to be able to afford that. Yeah. And it's going to force colleges to adjust. And also too, it's like, I think one thing that I've also kind of been worried about, because I've received like a lot of scholarships and awards to help pay for my schooling, is I wonder if a lot of those will be pulled because of funding. People, like, there's just no funding for them. So it's then, how are these universities that were used to handing out scholarships and stuff for like merit-based and all these other things, how are they going to be able to afford it now, especially if there isn't no college athletics?
Oh, well, that's going to be a huge problem, right? It's not going to be offset. It's interesting. There's actually, and this isn't to make fun of athletes, because my brother was an athlete. He went on a full ride scholarship to UCF in Florida, and he's played baseball and he's great at what he did. But I always make fun of him. I said, there's a great meme out there that says, oh, you did really good on a test. Here's $1,000, and then it's like beside that, hey, you can catch a football. Here's $100,000. Like, where's the value there, right? Yes, I understand athletics is important and the school makes money on it and this and that and whatever. But at the end of the day, like, if you misvalue people, if you pay people for their time and not the result, or you pay people for a skill set that's not really valuable to other people, the problem with that is you get entitlement, which you see a lot. You see a lot of professional athletes that go and get, they get into the NFL or the NHL and they blow all their money because basically they think they've made it, and they don't have management skills, right? So you start to realize that, certain people are being rewarded for the wrong things. And it's great because it financially offsets, the education. But where it's really bad is it creates these patterns, these mental patterns or these emotional patterns for these people that they can never get out of, because when they've, bought a Bentley at 29 years old, it's kind of screws you up a little bit, right? And so I think it's interesting you talk about school and scholarships and education, how they all kind of come together, because I think you're right. The scholarship programs, people are going to start realizing what's important. They're going to realize that on-the-job training is going to be the most valuable. Degrees, because of the speed of learning right now, degrees are going to be obsolete. You look at programming degrees, a lot of those are obsolete in 3 to 4 years, just because the speed of things are so fast. And then you go look at sports and you say, is it really worth it to have somebody go spend 4 years to play sports to offset their education? The answer is probably yes, because their debt load is much lower. But at the same time, the answer is also probably we shouldn't value that as much. We should value where the contribution is going to be. Is that in healthcare? Is that in science and technology? Is that in the arts? Like, where is that actually focused? because at the end of the day, it should be more about who's going to give back the most, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, but at the end of the day, there's only one thing that really runs this world, unfortunately, and that's money. And these universities, they want to make their money, and the best way to make their money, man, is they got to offer the best scholarship to the best players. And if you go back, like I watch a lot of 30 for 30s because I'm big into sports. You look back at like situations such as Reggie Bush, just like signing some memorabilia, and next thing you know, he has to, like, his Heisman stripped away of him. Like, he's basically erased from NCAA football history. But meanwhile, at the same time, the NCAA was making multi-millions of dollars off of this one athlete, because as soon as they hit stardom, they become the poster boy. And then next thing you know, you have jerseys with your name on it being sold that you weren't even getting money for.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the whole point, right? It's like people misunderstand. Like, they look at, and I use LeBron. I'm not even a basketball guy, but you use LeBron James. I think I heard this on maybe another podcast or some